Imagine arriving at an age when most people believe a life should already have taken shape, only to look around and find almost nothing that resembles success. No university degree, no respected position, no comfortable home, no lasting marriage, no financial security, only a collection of unfinished plans, lost jobs, unpaid debts, and memories of things that had gone wrong. Before history remembered Thomas Paine as a revolutionary writer, this was much closer to the man he actually was. He did not begin as a hero. He began as someone the world had almost overlooked, and yet, that forgotten man would eventually discover that a human life can remain unfinished far longer than society likes to admit. If you enjoy quiet journeys into history and the hidden lives behind famous names, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many people whose greatest chapters began only after everyone around them assumed their story had already been decided. Thomas Paine was one of them. Although for nearly 4 decades, there was very little evidence that anything extraordinary was waiting for him. Years later, words written by his hand would travel through homes, taverns, churches, workshops, and military camps. Ordinary people would gather around printed pages and listen. As someone read his arguments aloud, political leaders would discuss them. Soldiers would carry their ideas into war. One small pamphlet would spread through the American colonies in numbers almost impossible for its time, reaching hundreds of thousands of copies among a population of only a few million. But the most remarkable thing was not how many pages were printed. It was how deeply those pages entered the imagination of ordinary people. How does something like that happen? How does a man who struggles to manage his own life begin influencing the future of nations? How does someone without elite education learn to express political ideas with greater force than men trained in universities? And perhaps the strangest question of all is this: how can a person spend so many years appearing to fail, while quietly developing the exact qualities that history will later require? There was no obvious answer when Paine was young. There was only frustration, curiosity, and an increasing discomfort with accepting things simply because they had always been that way. History often becomes cleaner after enough time has passed. Failure disappears from portraits. Unpaid bills are forgotten. Embarrassing mistakes vanish beneath polished biographies. Eventually, the person becomes a name carved into stone, and we begin imagining that greatness must have been visible from the beginning. But nobody experiences life in that way. People wake tired. They worry about money. They choose badly. They lose opportunities. They disappoint others and themselves. Thomas Paine lived through all of this. Before becoming associated with revolutions, he spent years trying to solve the ordinary problem of how to survive. He was born in England in the early 18th century, into a society where birth still carried enormous weight. A person did not simply choose a life from unlimited possibilities. Family, religion, wealth, occupation, and social rank created boundaries. Before childhood had ended, the son of a craftsman was expected to become a craftsman. The child of privilege entered a different world entirely. The distance between those worlds could feel almost natural because it had existed for generations. People inherited not only property and titles, but expectations about where they belonged and how high they were permitted to rise. There is something about that old world that does not feel entirely ancient. Modern societies speak more often about freedom and opportunity, but invisible maps still surround people. Families still encourage safe careers. Communities still reward obedience. People still compare their lives with schedules they did not create. By a certain age, you should have achieved this. By another age, you should own that. You should know who you are. You should stop wandering. The details have changed, but the pressure is familiar. Thomas Paine grew up inside a much harder version of that pressure, where leaving the expected path could mean losing security altogether. His father worked as a maker of stays, the structured garments worn beneath clothing to shape the body according to the fashion of the age. It was skilled and respectable work, but it was not the life young Thomas imagined for himself. The workshop offered certainty: learn the craft, work carefully, earn a modest living, and perhaps one day pass the trade to another generation. For many people, such stability would have been a gift. For Paine, it slowly began to feel like a room whose walls moved closer each year. Security and confinement can sometimes wear surprisingly similar faces. The symbolism would become almost too perfect. Day after day, he worked with garments designed to hold the human body inside an approved shape. Fabric was measured, tightened, reinforced, and forced to follow a pattern. Outside the workshop, society seemed to operate in much the same way. A person was born into a position, taught what was respectable, shown which ambitions were reasonable, and encouraged to fit the form prepared for him. Perhaps Paine did not think about it in exactly those words at the time, but the discomfort was already there. Something in him resisted being shaped without permission. He read whenever he could. Books offered a space larger than the workshop and wider than the town around him. Science especially fascinated him because it suggested that the universe was not merely a collection of mysteries governed by tradition. Nature had principles. Movements could be studied, causes could be examined, patterns could be understood. If the heavens themselves followed discoverable laws, then why should human society be protected from the same kind of questioning? Why should a political institution be considered wise merely because it was old? Why should authority be accepted before anyone asked whether it was reasonable? These were still only small questions inside an unknown young man. There was no audience waiting for his conclusions. There was no revolution asking for his voice. There was only the growing sensation that the world had been arranged according to rules that people rarely examined. And once a person begins noticing those rules, it becomes difficult to stop. Why should one family inherit power while another inherited labor? Why should social rank determine how a person was treated? Why should tradition be mistaken for truth? Dangerous ideas do not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes they begin as quiet irritation during an ordinary afternoon. Paine wanted to escape long before he understood what he was escaping from. As a teenager, the sea seemed to offer another life. Beyond the familiar streets were distant ports, unfamiliar countries, and the possibility of becoming someone who was not already defined by his father and his trade. He attempted to leave and pursue that wider world, only to be brought back before the adventure truly began. The escape failed. Outwardly, almost nothing had changed. The same town remained. The same workshop remained. The same future appeared to be waiting. Inwardly, however, something had shifted. Once a person has imagined another life, the old one rarely fits as comfortably as before. Paine returned to the work expected of him, but he had already seen the outline of possibility. That can be a dangerous gift. It makes familiar walls more visible. It turns obedience into a choice rather than a fact. He still had no clear destination, no wealth, no powerful patron, and no reason to believe history would ever care about his opinions. But the first invisible boundary had already been crossed. He had begun to suspect that a life inherited from other people did not necessarily have to become a life accepted forever. And so, the young craftsman continued forward, without knowing where the questions would lead him. London still waited in the distance. Crowded coffeehouses waited there as well, filled with newspapers, political arguments, scientific ideas, merchants, radicals, and strangers willing to debate almost anything. Somewhere beyond the small town of his childhood was a much larger world in which a man could be judged, at least for a few hours, by the strength of an argument rather than the status of his family. Paine had not reached that world yet, but sooner or later, the workshop would no longer be able to hold him. The England into which Thomas Paine was born was a place where almost everything seemed to have a proper place, including people. Kings ruled because kings had always ruled. Nobles inherited land because their fathers had inherited it before them. The church stood beside the state, giving sacred language to earthly authority. Below them were merchants, craftsmen, laborers, farmers, and the poor, each carrying different burdens and different expectations. For most people, life was less a road of open choices than a narrow lane bordered by customs that had been standing for generations. Thatford, the market town where Paine entered the world, was small enough for familiarity to become a kind of social memory. People knew families, trades, reputations, and old stories. A child did not arrive as a blank page. He arrived already connected to a name, an occupation, and a place in the local order. Paine was born into a household that was respectable but modest. His father, Joseph, made stays for a living. The work required patience, careful hands, and precision. It offered stability, but very little chance of crossing the invisible lines that separated one class from another. Joseph Paine was also a Quaker, and that mattered far more than the family income might suggest. Quakers believed that every human being possessed spiritual worth, whether rich or poor, titled or unknown. They distrusted elaborate ceremony and refused many of the gestures that society used to remind people who stood above whom. A nobleman could wear silk and carry a famous name, but before God, he was not made from a different substance. Young Thomas grew up watching his father practice this quiet refusal to treat rank as something sacred, and the lesson entered him slowly. His mother, Frances, belonged to the Church of England, and her instincts moved in another direction. She cared more about social respectability and the established order around them. Where Joseph was plain, she was more aware of position, where he could accept a modest life. She seems to have wanted something more secure and more recognized. The home, therefore, contained two different visions of the world. One whispered that all people stood equal before God. The other understood very well that society did not treat them that way. Thomas grew up between those two truths. There are homes where children learn harmony, and there are homes where they learn contradiction. Contradiction can be uncomfortable, but it can also become an education. Paine saw that good people could believe different things with equal seriousness. He saw his father reject parts of the established church, while his mother remained connected to it. He was baptized within the Church of England, yet he also attended Quaker meetings. Before he had language for political philosophy, he was already living between authority and dissent, between inherited custom and the private judgment of conscience. The Quaker meeting house offered a strange kind of lesson for a restless child. There was no grand performance, no powerful priest standing above a crowd, no rich ceremony designed to impress the senses. There could be long stretches of silence. Anyone might speak, if moved to do so. The structure itself carried an idea that Thomas would encounter again in another form later in life. Truth did not necessarily need a title before it could be heard. Wisdom did not belong only to people with robes, offices, or inherited authority. Sometimes an ordinary voice could rise from an ordinary room and deserve attention. School gave him another view of authority. Boys sat on hard benches and learned the skills considered useful for their station: reading, writing, arithmetic, scripture. And for those who continued farther, the classical languages that marked the educated gentleman. The system was not designed to ask every child what kind of life he imagined. Education itself reflected the social ladder. Some boys were prepared for universities and professions. Others learned enough to enter trade. Thomas learned well, but his formal schooling ended young. The larger world of elite learning remained visible, yet mostly beyond reach. What he lacked in formal education, he began trying to replace with appetite. He read whatever came within reach: religious texts, almanacs, pamphlets, newspapers, moral essays, and eventually works that opened windows toward science and philosophy. He was especially drawn to the possibility that nature could be understood through reason. Astronomy revealed a universe immense beyond ordinary experience, yet not chaotic. Planets moved according to patterns. Eclipses could be predicted. Motion could be studied. The heavens did not become less magnificent when explained. In some ways, understanding made them even more astonishing. This idea would remain important. If nature could be examined instead of merely accepted, then perhaps human institutions could be examined as well. The question was still distant, almost invisible. But the habit of mind was forming. A king might be old as an institution, but age alone could not make monarchy rational. A church might possess centuries of authority, but centuries could not turn contradiction into truth. Custom could explain why people did something, but it could not automatically prove that they should continue doing it. Reason was beginning to become a small lamp in Paine's imagination. By the time his schooling ended, the shape of the expected future had become clear. He would enter his father's workshop. He would learn the family trade. He would become useful, respectable, and perhaps secure. From the outside, there was nothing cruel about this plan. Joseph was not trying to imprison his son. He was trying to give him a skill that could survive bad seasons and uncertain employers. Parents often call this love, and sometimes it is, but love can still point a child toward a life that does not fit him. Safety can still become a cage. So Thomas began learning the craft in earnest. Measurements had to be exact. Cloth had to be cut with care. Stiff supports had to be prepared and fitted into their proper channels. Every piece followed a pattern, and every mistake cost money. The work trained his hands, but his mind kept wandering beyond the room. Outside were roads he had never traveled, cities he had never seen, ships leaving for countries he could barely imagine. Inside were the same tools, the same patterns, the same careful motions repeated from morning into evening. The difference between security and freedom was becoming impossible to ignore. Perhaps this is where the deeper story truly begins, not with revolution and not with politics, but with a young man discovering that the life considered sensible by everyone around him felt unbearable from the inside. He had no plan for changing society. He did not yet possess a philosophy of government. He only knew that something in the arrangement of life seemed too fixed, too inherited, too certain of its own rightness. And once that feeling had taken root, the quiet town of his childhood could no longer contain all the questions growing inside him. The first real attempt to escape came when Thomas was still very young. The sea had begun to occupy his imagination as something larger than geography. It represented movement, distance, and the possibility of becoming someone beyond the narrow expectations of his hometown. Ships left English ports for places he had only encountered in books and stories. Somewhere beyond the horizon were colonies, foreign cities, unfamiliar languages, and lives that did not begin and end in the same workshop. To a restless teenager, the ocean must have looked like a door without walls. When Thomas was about 16 years old, he decided to test that door. Britain was moving toward another period of conflict with France, and private ships were recruiting young men willing to risk their lives at sea. Such voyages promised danger, but they also promised prize money and adventure. For someone with little property and few connections, the possibility of earning in one successful voyage what a craftsman might struggle years to save was difficult to ignore. Thomas quietly gathered what he could carry and left home, hoping to exchange the certainty of the workshop for the uncertainty of the ocean. He reached the coast and came close to beginning the life he had imagined. Then his father appeared. Joseph had followed him, determined to bring his son home before the sea swallowed him into a world from which many young men never returned. There was no need for dramatic violence. The reality itself was enough. Sailors died from disease, storms, accidents, and enemy fire. Privateering could produce sudden wealth, but it could just as easily end with a grave that had no name. Joseph offered his son The argument parents have offered restless children for centuries. You already have something safe. Thomas returned with him. The ship remained behind. The horizon disappeared. Once again, there were tools, measurements, cloth, and familiar streets. Perhaps everyone around him believed the problem had been solved. The boy had been saved from a foolish adventure and returned to a respectable future. But a person can return physically without returning inwardly. Thomas had walked far enough toward another life to know that another life existed. The workshop now seemed smaller, precisely because he had imagined the sea. Sometimes the first escape fails only because its real purpose is to make staying impossible. A few years later, when he was around 20, Thomas finally left Dartford for London. The distance was not enormous, but socially and psychologically, it was another world. London was one of the largest cities in Europe, crowded with hundreds of thousands of people, and filled with contradictions that a provincial town could never contain. Magnificent houses stood near desperate poverty. Carriages carrying wealthy families passed streets where laborers struggled to buy food. Merchants became rich through expanding trade while beggars slept in doorways. Everything seemed louder, faster, dirtier, richer, and more uncertain than the place he had left. For Thomas, anonymity itself may have felt like freedom. Back home, everyone knew who he was. He was Joseph Paine's son, the young staymaker, the restless boy who had once tried to run to sea. London did not care. Thousands of strangers moved past one another every day, without knowing names or histories. A man could disappear there, but he could also reinvent himself. Thomas found work as a journeyman in the trade his father had taught him. The work remained familiar, yet the city surrounding it offered something that the old workshop never could. Ideas were everywhere. He lived modestly, in rented rooms where comfort was limited and privacy was often a luxury. His wages were enough for survival, but little more. By day he worked with cloth, patterns, and customers. By evening, another education began. London contained coffee houses where a man could purchase a drink for a small amount and remain for hours among newspapers, pamphlets, arguments, and strangers. These places were sometimes described as penny universities, because knowledge there was not reserved for students with family, money, or university connections. Anyone who could enter, listen, read, and argue could participate. This was the kind of classroom Thomas had never been offered as a boy. Merchants discussed trade and war. Political men complained about ministers. Writers argued over books and theater. Religious skeptics questioned old doctrines. Supporters of government defended the existing order, while radicals asked whether that order deserved defending at all. Newspapers arrived, carrying reports from across Britain and from distant colonies. Pamphlets attacked public officials with a freedom rarely found in formal institutions. For a man whose education had ended early, the coffee house became a doorway into the intellectual life he had once been told belonged to another class. Thomas listened before he became confident enough to speak. He absorbed arguments about liberty, political representation, taxation, religion, commerce, and the limits of government. He encountered ideas shaped by thinkers who had asked whether rulers existed by divine command or by the consent of those they governed. What fascinated him was not only the content of these arguments, but the fact that people could challenge institutions that had once seemed beyond questioning. The same habit he had developed while reading about science now turned toward politics. If a claim was true, it should survive examination. If it failed, age could not rescue it. He also discovered something about his own voice. Many educated men spoke in a style shaped by classical schooling, filled with references to ancient writers and phrases designed to demonstrate learning. Thomas did not possess that kind of education. He could not compete by displaying scholarship he had never received. Instead, he began doing something simpler. He listened to complicated arguments, found the central idea, and expressed it in ordinary language. What might have sounded like a disadvantage slowly became a strength. He spoke as people spoke outside universities. He did not decorate an idea until its meaning disappeared. This directness sometimes impressed people and sometimes irritated them. Thomas was not naturally skilled at pretending agreement when he believed someone was wrong. Authority alone did not persuade him. Employers discovered the same quality that men in coffeehouses were beginning to notice. He questioned instructions. He argued about methods. He objected when practices seemed inefficient or unfair. He could perform the work, but obedience did not come easily. The very trait that would later give his political writing unusual force made ordinary employment increasingly difficult. A revolutionary temperament is romantic in a history book. In a workshop, it can simply look troublesome. Jobs came and went. Money remained scarce. The great city educated him without rewarding him. He learned about politics while failing to build a secure career. He encountered arguments about liberty while depending on employers he frequently annoyed. He began understanding society more deeply while becoming less successful at fitting into it. There is a strange cruelty in that kind of growth. Inwardly, a person may be changing rapidly, while outwardly, his life appears to be moving nowhere. Nobody looking at Thomas during those London years would have seen a future revolutionary. They would have seen a craftsman struggling to remain employed. After several years, he returned to Thatford with little material evidence that London had improved his life. He had no fortune and no important position, yet he did not return as the same young man who had left. He had seen wealth beside misery, education outside universities, and ordinary men debating questions that shaped nations. He had discovered that arguments could cross boundaries, that social rank could not. More importantly, he had learned that he possessed a voice capable of making difficult ideas understandable. The world had not yet asked him to use that voice. For the moment, life was about to become painfully personal again. When Thomas returned from London, he carried home something difficult to measure. There was no fortune in his pocket, and no impressive position attached to his name. Outwardly, the experiment had failed. He had gone to the largest city in England and returned, still dependent on the trade he once wanted to escape. But London had changed the scale of his thinking. He had seen wealth beside hunger, intelligence outside universities, and arguments that questioned institutions most people considered permanent. Returning home meant returning to familiar streets, but he could no longer look at them with familiar eyes. Perhaps he hoped that independence would make the old trade easier to accept. Instead of working under another master, he attempted to establish himself and build a respectable life of his own. There was something almost conventional about what followed. He married a young woman named Mary Lambert, the daughter of another tradesman. For a brief period, the restless young man appeared to be entering the life everyone had expected for him. There would be work, marriage, children, and perhaps a modest household where uncertainty could finally settle into routine. For once, the future seemed quiet. Mary soon became pregnant, and the pregnancy must have deepened that feeling of beginning again. A child could transform a workshop from a place of confinement into something that supported a family. The same trade Thomas had once hated might now become the means by which he protected people he loved. Perhaps he imagined passing skills to a son, as his father had passed them to him. Perhaps he simply experienced the ordinary hope that comes when two people believe their life is about to grow larger. History remembers revolutions, but people usually live first through smaller expectations like these. Then, in the spring of 1760, the future disappeared almost at once. Mary went into labor, and something went terribly wrong. Childbirth in that century remained dangerous in ways modern life can make difficult to imagine. There were no antibiotics, no reliable blood transfusions, and few effective ways to respond. When complications became severe, families understood that birth could bring celebration and death through the same doorway. In Thomas Paine's home, both possibilities arrived together, and only one remained. Mary died, and the child she had carried did not survive either. He was still a young man, yet suddenly, the life he had been trying to build had emptied around him. One day there had been a wife, an expected child, and the possibility of becoming the kind of husband and father ordinary society understood. Soon afterward, there was only absence. Grief has a way of changing the appearance of familiar things. A chair becomes the place where someone no longer sits. A street becomes a memory. A room becomes too quiet. The workshop itself, already associated with frustration, now belonged to a future that no longer existed. Thomas closed the business. There was little left in that fort that he wished to preserve. The trade of his father, the expectations of his childhood, and now the grave of his wife had become tangled together. He left the town again. But this departure was different from the teenage attempt to reach the sea. Then, he had been running toward adventure. Now he was moving away from loss. There are moments when leaving is not ambition at all. It is simply the body carrying itself somewhere. The memories are slightly less close. For a period, Thomas drifted through uncertain work until a new occupation appeared. He joined the government excise service, becoming one of the many officers responsible for collecting duties on common goods. Tobacco, alcohol, soap, candles, salt, and other products could all be subject to taxation. The work carried a certain respectability because it belonged to the government, and the salary arrived with greater regularity than the unpredictable income of a craftsman. After years of instability, that regularity must have looked attractive. Perhaps a government position could provide the structure that private life had refused him. But the excise service contained its own contradictions. Officers were expected to inspect warehouses, measure goods, examine records, calculate duties, and enforce rules that merchants often resented. They carried official authority, yet their salaries were modest. They were expected to resist corruption while living close enough to poverty that a small bribe could represent a meaningful amount of money. Merchants wanted flexible officers. Supervisors wanted perfect records. The government demanded honesty without always providing the conditions that made honesty easy. Thomas had entered another system where the rules looked simpler from above than they felt from inside. The daily routine was repetitive in a different way from stay-making. Instead of measuring cloth, he measured barrels and inventories. Instead of following patterns, he followed regulations. Informs had to be completed carefully. Calculations had to be checked. Visits had to be recorded. Once again, the man who disliked confinement found himself inside a life built from repetition. Yet something important had changed. Now he was seeing government not as an abstract institution discussed in a coffee house, but as a machine operating through ordinary employees. Policy became paperwork. Authority became inspections. Corruption became something produced by incentives as much as by character. Within a few years, the position ended badly. Thomas was dismissed after being accused of certifying inspections without properly carrying them out. Whether he had followed a common shortcut or been judged more harshly than others remained less important to his life than the result. He lost the job and once again found himself without a secure direction. Another promising path had collapsed. Another institution had found him difficult to keep. To someone watching from outside, the pattern would have been discouragingly familiar. Thomas Paine seemed capable of turning opportunity into instability with remarkable consistency. He tried teaching for a time, instructing boys in basic English. Even there, a small piece of his later style began to appear. He preferred clarity. He cared less for elaborate displays of learning than for sentences that communicated exactly what they meant. The classroom was not his final calling, but it strengthened a belief that had already grown in London. Complicated language was not proof of complicated thought. Sometimes it merely protected weak ideas from examination. If something mattered, it should be possible to explain it plainly. Years later, This instinct would help political philosophy travel far beyond educated circles. Thomas did something characteristic after losing the government position. He argued his way back toward another chance. Through persistent petitions, he eventually persuaded the excise authorities to restore him to service. Second chances were not automatic, especially for men already marked by dismissal. His ability to the same mind that had created friction in workplaces could also organize facts into an argument. Writing was still only a practical tool, not yet the force that would define his life, but its usefulness was becoming clearer. The doors that personality closed could sometimes be reopened by language. In the late 1760s, he was sent to the town of Lewes in Sussex. There, something finally began to come together. Lewes was not London, but it contained a vigorous culture of discussion. Thomas lodged with a tobacco seller named Samuel Olive, whose shop attracted people interested in politics, public affairs, and argument behind an ordinary commercial storefront. Conversations unfolded about Parliament, taxation, religion, liberty, and the growing tension between Britain and its American colonies. Thomas had once discovered ideas in London coffee houses. Now, he found a smaller room where he could test his own. The group that gathered there became known for its stubborn debates. Men disagreed openly and expected one another to defend their positions. For Thomas, this environment must have felt natural. The qualities that irritated employers were useful here. He could question, he could challenge, he could reduce a complicated argument to its central weakness. Little by little, the failures of his life were beginning to connect with the ideas he had collected. Poverty, hierarchy, low wages, arbitrary authority, inherited privilege, and institutional hypocrisy no longer looked like unrelated frustrations. They began to resemble parts of the same larger question. What should authority be for? And who should it serve? Thomas Paine still had no fame, no political office, and no reason to expect that anyone beyond a small circle would care about his answer. But for the first time, his experiences and his ideas were beginning to move toward one another. The craftsman, widower, dismissed employee, teacher, and government officer were slowly becoming the writer he did not yet know he would be. And in Lewes, one ordinary dispute about the wages of tax collectors would soon give him a reason to put those thoughts on paper. Lewes gave Thomas Paine something he had spent much of his life searching for without knowing its name. It gave him a place where disagreement was not automatically treated as disrespect. After years of workshops, government offices, and employers who expected obedience, he found himself among men who enjoyed argument for its own sake. Evenings could stretch late as candles burned lower and tobacco smoke settled above the room. Politics moved from distant newspapers into living conversation. People challenged one another, defended positions, changed subjects, returned to old disagreements, and sometimes left without agreeing on anything at all. The gatherings around Samuel Olive, and the group later remembered as the Headstrong Club, became a kind of second education. Thomas had already learned from London coffee houses that ideas did not belong exclusively to universities. In Lewes, he learned something more intimate. He learned how arguments sounded when ordinary people tested them against ordinary experience. A theory about taxation meant something different when the person discussing it actually paid the tax. A theory about government changed when someone could describe the official who had entered his warehouse. Political philosophy became less abstract when everyone around the table lived beneath its consequences. Thomas read more seriously during these years. The writings of John Locke gave philosophical language to questions he had carried for a long time. If legitimate government depended upon the consent of those governed, then political authority could not simply be explained by tradition. Government was not a mysterious inheritance descending from heaven. It was a human arrangement created for human purposes, and if an arrangement failed those purposes, then perhaps people had the right to alter it. This idea was not entirely new in Britain. But Thomas had a habit of following ideas farther than polite society often preferred. Science continued to shape the way he thought as well. The universe described by Isaac Newton seemed governed by principles that did not change according to the title of the observer. Gravity did not become stronger for a duke and weaker for a laborer. Nature showed no respect for aristocratic rank. The thought contained a quiet beauty. Perhaps society did not have to remain a collection of inherited privileges and ancient accidents. Perhaps political institutions could also be examined according to principles. Did they work? Were they just? Did they protect people? If they failed those tests, why should age alone save them? These questions gradually became more dangerous. Thomas began looking at monarchy not as something inevitable, but as something that required explanation. Why should political wisdom pass through a family bloodline? Intelligence did not reliably pass from father to son. Neither did courage, judgment, or moral character. Why, then, should authority over millions of people be inherited as casually as a house or a piece of land? The more he considered hereditary government, the stranger it appeared. Institutions that had once seemed permanent began to look like human habits, preserved so long that people had forgotten they were habits. Yet, Thomas was still employed by the government. He increasingly questioned. That contradiction forced a certain caution. A man could debate boldly among trusted companions and still need his salary the next morning. Freedom of thought does not remove the price of bread. He continued his work as an excise officer, riding through the surrounding countryside, inspecting goods, keeping records, calculating duties, and observing the daily machinery of taxation. These duties gave him something political theory alone could not provide. He saw how government policies entered the smallest parts of ordinary life, and how poorly designed systems could create the behavior they claimed to condemn. The problem that troubled him most was the pay of excise officers themselves. These men carried serious responsibilities and were expected to remain completely honest. Yet many earned barely enough to maintain a respectable existence. They needed lodging, clothing, food, equipment, and often a horse to travel between inspections. Illness could ruin a household. The death of a horse could create debt. Any unexpected expense could become a crisis. Meanwhile, merchants who wished to avoid taxes sometimes had strong financial reasons to offer favors. The government demanded incorruptible officers, while placing them inside conditions that made corruption constantly tempting. Thomas saw a contradiction that felt almost mathematical. If an officer was paid too little to live properly, only a few choices remained. He could accept poverty despite full-time work. He could search for additional work and neglect his official duties. Or he could take money from people who wanted him to look away. The system punished corruption while helping produce the circumstances in which corruption became attractive. To Thomas, this was not simply a matter of individual morality. It was a failure of design. If government wanted honest service, then honest service needed to be economically possible. So he began writing. This was not yet the Thomas Paine who would speak about revolutions and the rights of nations. His first important political effort concerned something far more ordinary: wages, expenses, government efficiency, the daily difficulties of men doing unpopular work for inadequate pay. But the method already contained the style that would later make him famous. He started with a problem people could understand. He described the practical consequences. He used calculations rather than ornamental language. Then, he moved toward a solution. Pay officers enough to live honestly, and honest enforcement might return more revenue than the increased salaries cost. The argument was simple enough to sound obvious. Once someone said it clearly, that would become one of Thomas Paine's greatest abilities. He could make a complicated institutional problem feel as understandable as a household decision. Instead of surrounding his case with classical references, he asked readers to look at expenses and consequences. If a government created impossible conditions for its workers, why should anyone be surprised when those workers failed? Reform was not charity. It was reason. The pamphlet showed Thomas that his experiences as a poorly paid employee could be transformed into an argument larger than his own frustration. He did not merely write the case and leave it on a table. He committed himself to the cause. Thousands of copies were printed, and Thomas traveled to London, hoping to bring the issue before men with political power. He met other excise officers, sought support, spoke with people connected to Parliament, and tried to turn a logical argument into actual reform. The experience was another education, although not the one he wanted. He discovered that proving a problem existed was not the same as persuading powerful people to solve it. The reason could explain what should happen. Politics decided whether anyone cared. Members of Parliament could listen politely and then continue with other business. The officers lacked enough influence to make their grievances expensive to ignore. Thomas had believed that a clear case, supported by facts, should naturally produce action. Instead, he saw interests, connections, status, and political convenience standing between argument and change. The lesson was painful because it reached beyond wages. Perhaps unjust systems survived, not because nobody understood their flaws, but because the people benefiting from them had little reason to change them. A good argument could reveal injustice. It could not automatically force power to surrender its advantages. When Thomas returned to Lewis, he had gained experience, but not victory. Money had been spent. Months had passed. His superiors now knew that he was willing to organize other officers and carry complaints toward Parliament. The government employee who already questioned authority had made himself more visible to authority. At home, other problems were also gathering. The tobacco business, connected to his household, needed attention. Debts were beginning to grow. His second marriage offered less happiness than stability had promised. Once again, the different parts of his life seemed to be moving toward the same familiar edge. He could not yet see how close he was to losing almost everything. He had written his first serious political argument and discovered that words could organize frustration into something powerful. But the world had not rewarded him for it. Instead, his financial situation was weakening, and his official career was becoming more fragile. The man who wanted to repair one small part of government was about to be pushed outside that government entirely. And sometimes, history begins precisely there. When a person finally loses enough of the old world that he becomes free to imagine another one. By the spring of 1774, the different weaknesses in Thomas Paine's life finally collapsed into one another. The tobacco business connected to his household was failing. Debts had accumulated faster than they could be paid. His second marriage had become increasingly strained, and the stability he had once hoped to build in Lewis was disappearing. At the same time, his political activity had made him troublesome in the eyes of his employers. He had spent too much time away from his official duties while trying to improve the conditions of excise officers. The consequences arrived almost together. The shop was sold to satisfy creditors. Thomas and his wife separated. Then the government dismissed him from the excise service for the second time. And this time there would be no easy path back. The respectable position he had fought to recover was gone. The business was gone. The marriage was effectively over. At an age when many men were becoming more secure, Thomas found himself moving in the opposite direction. The life he had spent decades trying to construct seemed to be dismantling itself in a matter of months. He was 37 years old, and almost every conventional measure of success had turned against him. He had tried his father's trade and abandoned it. He had attempted marriage twice and found neither lasting happiness nor family. He had worked for the government and been dismissed twice. He had participated in business and watched debt consume it. He had written a reasonable appeal for reform and discovered that reason alone could not persuade those who had no political incentive to listen. If someone had summarized his life at that moment, the word failure would have seemed painfully difficult to avoid. There is an age when failure begins to feel different. When a person is young, disappointment can still be described as preparation. There is time to start again, people say. There are other roads. There are other cities. But as the years gather, those comforting sentences become quieter. Friends settle into careers. Families grow. Younger people arrive with new energy. Starting again begins to look less romantic and more frightening. Thomas had already started again several times. Now he had to face a harsher possibility. Perhaps the problem was not circumstance. Perhaps he simply did not know how to succeed. Most people who met him then would have had little reason to predict greatness. He was not standing before cheering crowds. He was not advising generals or shaping governments. He was a middle-aged man with uncertain income and an increasingly difficult reputation. He argued too much. He challenged authority too easily. He had a talent for making himself unwelcome in systems that demanded obedience. Even his intelligence had produced little practical reward. To the abilities that would later make him famous had so far mostly made ordinary life harder. History had not yet revealed whether those qualities were gifts or defects. Thomas returned to London with no clear future. He stayed where he could, searched for opportunities, and tried to determine what remained possible. London was familiar now, but he returned to it as a different man. The young craftsman who had once entered the city, looking for work, had become someone who had experienced grief, government, political organizing, debt, and repeated dismissal. He understood more about the world, but understanding had not made life easier. Perhaps that is one of the cruelties of experience. Sometimes the clearer a person sees a system, the less comfortable he becomes inside it. Then, through circumstances that remain uncertain in their exact details, Thomas Paine met Benjamin Franklin. Few encounters in his life would matter more. Franklin was already famous on both sides of the Atlantic. He was known for science, invention, writing, diplomacy, and his unusual ability to move between intellectual circles and practical affairs. He was also deeply involved in the growing conflict between Britain and the American colonies. The political relationship across the Atlantic was becoming more dangerous by the month, and Franklin understood that the situation might soon demand people with unusual talents. What exactly did Franklin see in Thomas? Perhaps he recognized intelligence that had never received formal polish. Perhaps he appreciated a man who had risen through self-education rather than inherited privilege. Perhaps Thomas spoke about politics with the same directness that had already made him effective in debate. Whatever the reason, Franklin did not see only the failed tradesman or dismissed tax officer. He saw someone who might be useful in America. That judgment was remarkable because almost every institution in Thomas's life had recently reached the opposite conclusion. Where others saw trouble, Franklin seems to have noticed possibility. Franklin gave him a letter of introduction that could help him establish himself in Philadelphia. The document was physically small, but to Thomas, it offered something much larger than employment. It offered distance. England had become crowded with memories of failure. There were old jobs, broken relationships, disappointed expectations, and a social order he increasingly distrusted. America represented no guarantee of success, but it offered something he desperately needed, a place where his past might not arrive before he did. Sometimes, a new world begins simply because nobody there knows the old version of you. In September of 1774, Thomas boarded a ship bound for Philadelphia. He carried little with him. There was no fortune to protect him from failure, and no important title that would command respect when he arrived. He had a letter, some personal belongings, a mind crowded with arguments, and the uncertain hope that another continent might offer a different future. The Atlantic crossing would take weeks. For a man who had once tried to escape to sea as a teenager, the moment carried a strange echo. This time no father appeared at the harbor to bring him home. The ocean did not welcome him gently. Ships of the period were crowded, uncomfortable, and vulnerable to disease. Passengers lived close together with limited sanitation, and illness could spread quickly during long voyages. Sickness broke out aboard the vessel, and Thomas became seriously ill. The journey that was supposed to begin a new life nearly ended the old one before America even appeared. For days, he lay weak and feverish while the ship continued westward. There was something almost cruelly appropriate about it. Even his escape from failure seemed determined to make him suffer before allowing him through. When the ship finally reached Philadelphia late in the year, Thomas was too weak to walk ashore normally. He had to be helped from the vessel and cared for while he recovered. This was not the arrival of a triumphant immigrant, stepping confidently into opportunity. There was no dramatic entrance. A sick man reached a strange city with almost nothing and depended on the kindness of people who respected Franklin's recommendation. Had his illness become slightly worse, the story might have ended there, before anyone in America had reason to remember his name. Instead, he survived. Slowly, strength returned, and when Thomas finally began walking through Philadelphia, he entered a social atmosphere unlike the England he had known. The city was busy and imperfect, divided by wealth and touched by the injustices of its age, including slavery, but compared with Britain, its hierarchy seemed less ancient and less fixed. There was no hereditary aristocracy ruling daily life in the same manner. Religious diversity was greater. Merchants, craftsmen, printers, and self-educated men could enter public discussions with fewer barriers. Ability did not erase class, but it could sometimes travel farther. For perhaps the first time, Thomas Paine had arrived somewhere where his disadvantages did not completely define him. His accent mattered less. The jobs he had lost in England mattered less. His failed businesses and marriages belonged to another continent. What mattered now was whether he could write, think, and make himself useful through the connections surrounding Franklin's introduction. He soon found work connected to a magazine in Philadelphia. After years of trying to force himself into occupations that never seemed to fit, he was finally being paid to work with the one thing that had followed him through every failure: words. And almost as soon as he found that place, history began moving toward him. Tension between Britain and the colonies was deepening. Arguments about taxes were becoming arguments about rights. Arguments about rights were beginning to become questions about political authority itself. Within months, armed men would meet at Lexington and Concord, and the debate would no longer belong only to pamphlets and taverns. Thomas Paine had crossed an ocean, looking for another chance at life. Without knowing it, he had arrived at the exact moment when an entire society was beginning to ask the questions he had spent years learning how to answer. Philadelphia gave Thomas Paine something England had never truly offered him. It gave him the feeling that a man could arrive without a title, without wealth, without an impressive family name, and still be taken seriously if he had something worth saying. The city was far from equal, and injustice still existed everywhere. But the atmosphere felt different. Printers, merchants, craftsmen, lawyers, sailors, and political thinkers crossed paths in streets and taverns where arguments moved quickly. For Paine, who had spent years feeling misplaced, the city seemed less like a destination than an opening. He began working with the Pennsylvania magazine, where his ability to turn complicated subjects into direct language finally became useful in a practical way. Instead of measuring cloth or calculating duties, he worked with sentences. He wrote about society, politics, science, morality, and public affairs. The job did not make him wealthy, but it placed him near the center of conversation. More importantly, it allowed him to observe a society already becoming restless. People were no longer merely complaining about distant decisions from London. They were beginning to wonder what those decisions revealed about the relationship itself. Then came the spring of 1775. In Massachusetts, British soldiers moved toward Lexington and Concord in an attempt to seize colonial military supplies. Armed colonists met them. Shots were fired. Men died. By the time news reached Philadelphia, the argument had changed forever. What had previously been discussed through petitions, taxes, boycotts, and political speeches now had blood behind it. War had not yet been fully understood. But violence had crossed a threshold. Once people have buried neighbors, the language of reconciliation becomes harder to speak without hearing the dead beneath every sentence. Across the colonies, the same question began appearing in different forms. What exactly were they fighting for? Many people still believed the answer was simple. They wanted the rights they believed belonged to them as English subjects. They wanted Parliament to stop imposing policies without proper representation. They wanted unfair laws removed and old relationships restored. Even some men who resisted British authority continued to speak warmly of the king. Independence seemed dangerously extreme, separating from the most powerful empire many of them had ever known. Sounded less like a plan than a leap into darkness. Thomas Paine heard these arguments and recognized something that his American neighbors could not experience in the same way. He had spent nearly 4 decades inside the society they were trying to negotiate with. He knew British institutions, not from a distance, but from workshops, government offices, petitions, employers, class divisions, and failed attempts at reform. To him, the crisis did not look like a temporary misunderstanding between a government and its colonies. The problem seemed deeper. If the structure itself concentrated power through monarchy and inherited privilege, then changing a few policies would not remove the source of the conflict. That conclusion was dangerous. Calling for independence was not an ordinary political opinion. Rebellion against the crown could be treated as treason, and treason carried consequences far beyond public criticism. Yet, Paine increasingly believed that someone had to say openly what others were beginning to think privately. A continent could not remain suspended forever between resistance and loyalty. Either British authority was legitimate and should ultimately be obeyed, or the colonies had the right to govern themselves. The middle ground was becoming narrower with every new confrontation. Soon, Paine began working on an argument that would force the question into the open. He wrote at night, often in modest rooms lit by candlelight, shaping and reshaping his sentences until they sounded less like political theory and more like conversation. He was not writing for professors. He imagined farmers, shopkeepers, apprentices, craftsmen, and soldiers, people who had work to finish in the morning and little patience for pages designed merely to display education. He wanted the argument to feel familiar before it felt radical. The strength of the writing would come from making a shocking conclusion seem like something the reader had almost understood already, waiting only for the right words. The pamphlet that emerged was called Common Sense. The title itself carried part of the strategy. Paine was not presenting independence as an exotic theory available only to philosophers. He was suggesting the opposite. Perhaps the strange position was not independence. Perhaps the strange position was allowing millions of people across an ocean to remain permanently governed by a distant monarchy. He began by asking readers to reconsider assumptions so old that people no longer remembered choosing them. Habit, he understood, could make almost anything feel natural. A custom repeated for generations could eventually disguise itself as truth. From there, Paine separated society from government. People naturally formed communities because cooperation made life richer and safer. Society grew from human needs and human connection. Government was different. Government became necessary because people could also injure one another, deceive one another, and pursue selfish interests. Therefore, government was not sacred. It was a tool, and like any tool, its value depended on whether it performed the purpose for which it existed. This was a quiet but powerful shift. If government was a human creation, then ordinary people were allowed to judge it rather than kneel before it. Then he turned toward monarchy. Why, he asked in effect, should political wisdom be inherited? No family could guarantee intelligence in every generation. Courage did not follow bloodlines reliably. Neither did judgment, honesty, or compassion. Yet, hereditary government acted as though the accident of birth could produce the person most qualified to rule. To Paine, the idea became more absurd, the more plainly it was described. Strip away ceremony, crowns, ancient language, and royal tradition, and what remained was simply one family claiming political authority because earlier generations of that family had possessed it. He applied the same plain reasoning to the relationship between Britain and America. Supporters of reconciliation argued that Britain protected the colonies. Paine answered that many dangers facing the colonies existed precisely because they belonged to British imperial conflicts. Supporters said Britain was the mother country. Paine reminded readers that Americans came from many parts of Europe, not only England. Supporters warned that independence would damage trade. Paine argued that separation could open commerce beyond British restrictions. Each argument was taken from the realm of emotion and examined as though two neighbors were discussing a practical problem across a table. But Paine understood that logic alone would not be enough. People do not risk property, security, family, and life because an argument is merely efficient. They need to feel that sacrifice belongs to something larger. So the pamphlet slowly widened its horizon. The conflict was no longer simply about taxes or representation. It became a chance to create a political society less dependent on ancient privilege. America could become more than a collection of colonies, resisting London. It could become evidence that ordinary people were capable of building government from consent rather than inheritance. Suddenly, the future itself seemed to enter the room. This was the emotional transformation at the heart of common sense. Fear of losing Britain became curiosity about what might exist without it. Rebellion became creation. Separation became beginning. Paine was not asking Americans only what they wanted to escape. He was asking what they might build if the old connection finally broke. The question reached farther than policy because it touched a private human desire recognizable in every age. What becomes possible when the structure that has always defined your life is no longer there? For Thomas Paine, that question had already shaped nearly 40 years of personal failure. The pamphlet appeared in January of 1776. It was not large, and its author had been in America for little more than a year. There was no obvious reason for such a document to change the direction of a continent. Yet copies began moving rapidly, from hand to hand. People bought them, borrowed them, discussed them, and read them aloud to those who could not read for themselves. The failed craftsman, who had once struggled to keep a government job, had finally found the moment for which all those years of argument had unknowingly prepared him. And then something happened that even Paine could not have fully predicted. The words escaped the room in which they had been written. They entered taverns, military camps, churches, workshops, and homes. They became part of conversations between people who had never heard his voice and would never meet him. A man who had spent most of his life trying unsuccessfully to find his place had written something that seemed to find its place almost everywhere. The question was no longer whether anyone would listen to Thomas Paine. The question was, what would happen now that so many people had begun to? The response to common sense moved faster than anyone could comfortably measure. Printers reproduced it. Newspapers discussed it. Copies passed from one town to another, until the pamphlet seemed to exist everywhere at once. Within only a few months, more than 120,000 copies were circulating. And before the year was over, the total may have approached 500,000 in a population of only a few million people. Numbers like that are easy to repeat and difficult to feel. What mattered was that Paine had entered thousands of private conversations without ever entering the rooms. People heard the pamphlet in taverns where someone stood near a table and read aloud to men who could not afford their own copy. Soldiers encountered its arguments in camps. Ministers considered its language from pulpits. Families discussed it beside evening fires, trying to imagine what independence might demand from them. The printed page became almost social rather than private. One copy could reach many listeners. Words moved through mouths as much as through paper, and each time they were repeated, the radical possibility of separation from Britain became slightly less unimaginable than it had been the day before. This was perhaps Paine's greatest achievement. He did not create every desire for independence. Anger already existed. Distrust already existed. Fighting had already begun. What he did was give those scattered emotions a structure. People who had sensed that reconciliation might be impossible now possessed arguments they could repeat. People who favored independence but struggled to explain why could borrow his language and reasoning. Uncertainty became conversation, conversation became conviction, and conviction began changing the political atmosphere. An idea once treated as dangerous enough to whisper was slowly becoming respectable enough to defend in public. Important figures noticed. George Washington read the pamphlet while commanding the Continental Army and recognized its effect on morale and political thinking. John Adams had already supported independence, yet even men who had argued the case before Paine could see that this small book reached people formal political speeches often did not. Benjamin Franklin, who had once offered an unsuccessful Englishman a letter of introduction, could now watch that same man become one of the most discussed writers in America. The transformation had taken barely more than a year. History sometimes waits decades before moving all at once. Not everyone welcomed him. Loyalists attacked common sense and attacked Paine personally. They questioned his judgment, his motives, and even his right to speak so confidently about a country he had only recently entered. In one sense, their anger revealed the pamphlet's success. No one wastes much energy answering a book that has failed to matter. Opposition gave the work another kind of publicity. Every public response confirmed that the argument could no longer be ignored. Paine, who had once struggled to persuade government officials to raise the salaries of tax collectors, was now forcing an empire's supporters to answer him. Fame arrived, but money did not follow in the way it might have. Paine could have treated common sense as the work that finally rescued him from years of financial uncertainty. Instead, he cared more about circulation than ownership. He wanted the pamphlet to remain inexpensive and widely available. Profits were not his central concern. This decision revealed a contradiction that would follow him for the rest of his life. He could understand political systems with unusual clarity while remaining remarkably impractical about his own security. The man who argued about how nations should govern themselves never learned how to protect himself from poverty. By the summer of 1776, independence had moved from argument toward declaration. Congress formally broke with Britain, and the colonies entered a new stage of the struggle. But declaring a nation and creating one are not the same thing. Paper can announce independence in an afternoon. Armies must survive winter. Governments need money. Soldiers need food, shoes, weapons, and confidence. The emotional clarity of revolution quickly met the physical difficulty of war. The future that had seemed luminous in political language became muddy roads, empty stomachs, unpaid wages, fear, and the possibility of defeat. By the end of that year, the American cause looked dangerously fragile. British forces had driven Washington's army from New York. Defeats accumulated. Soldiers deserted. Enlistments were ending, and many men wondered whether continuing the struggle made any sense. The British Army was trained, supplied, and experienced. The Continental Army often looked like the opposite. Men marched in poor clothing through winter weather, carrying exhaustion as heavily as their equipment. Optimism had been easy. When independence lived in pamphlets, it became harder when independence meant sleeping cold, while a professional army pushed you backward across the countryside. Paine did not observe this suffering from a comfortable study. He joined the Continental Army and traveled close enough to see what war looked like after the speeches ended. He watched tired men retreat across New Jersey. He saw the condition of soldiers whose political beliefs could not warm their feet or fill their stomachs. This mattered to his writing. The tone required by a debating room was no longer enough. These men did not need another abstract explanation of monarchy. They needed a reason to believe that hardship itself did not prove the cause was lost. In December, with winter closing around the army, Paine began writing again. The setting was very different from the room where common sense had taken shape. There were no quiet discussions about political theory. There was cold uncertainty and the heavy knowledge that a revolution could die before the new year. Tradition remembers him writing near a campfire, using whatever surface was available while the army struggled through retreat. Whether every detail survived perfectly matters less than the emotional truth of the moment. Paine was trying to write directly into despair, before despair became surrender. The words that emerged began with an acknowledgement rather than a promise. These were difficult times. Loyalty was being tested precisely because loyalty was expensive now. It was easy to support a cause in sunshine. Easier still when victory seemed close. The deeper test came when the road disappeared into winter, and no one could guarantee that sacrifice would be rewarded. Paine understood that people often need their suffering named before they can be asked to endure it. He did not pretend the struggle was easy. He made difficulty itself part of the meaning. The first installment of the American Crisis appeared in December of 1776. Its language spread through the army and beyond it. Washington had passages read to troops before the campaign that led to the crossing of the Delaware River and the attack at Trenton. The victory there did not win the war, but it interrupted the feeling of inevitable defeat. Nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers were captured, and for a frightened revolutionary army, the psychological effect mattered as much as the tactical success. Suddenly, retreat was no longer the only story available. Paine would continue writing crisis papers throughout the war. Returning to the page whenever the revolution seemed exhausted, he became something unusual. Not merely a political theorist, and not merely a propagandist, but a writer who understood timing. Common sense had appeared when people needed permission to imagine independence. The American crisis appeared when those same people needed permission to believe that independence could survive failure. In each case, the argument met an emotion already present in the public mind. Paine's gift was not creating the emotion, it was finding language strong enough to carry it. And still, the pattern of his life remained strangely unchanged beneath the fame. The works that helped sustain a revolution brought him little lasting wealth. He accepted government positions and repeatedly found himself uncomfortable with secrecy, diplomacy, and institutional restraint. He still spoke too directly. He still believed that truth should be said even when silence was more convenient. The quality that made his writing powerful continued, making his personal life difficult. America had finally discovered what Thomas Paine was good for. But that did not mean Thomas Paine had learned how to live comfortably inside the world he was helping to create. As the war continued, Thomas Paine discovered that helping to inspire a revolution was very different from living through one. Independence had been declared, but nothing about the future was secure. Battles were won and lost. Supplies disappeared. Governments argued over money. Soldiers waited for wages that often arrived late or not at all. The great principles that had sounded so clear on paper now had to survive confusion, exhaustion, and competing interests. Paine continued writing, but he also stepped closer to the machinery of the new government and discovered that revolutions create bureaucracy almost as quickly as they destroy old authority. He served for a time as secretary to a congressional committee concerned with foreign affairs. The position brought him into contact with information that ordinary citizens never saw. Letters arrived from diplomats, questions of military supplies, foreign alliances, loans, and secret negotiations passed across desks. Paine had spent years criticizing governments from the outside, where moral choices could appear sharp and simple. Now he was seeing political necessity from within. Revolutionary leaders sometimes depended on secrecy. Diplomats sometimes spoke differently in private than they did in public. Ideals remained important, But survival forced men into compromises that did not fit neatly inside philosophical arguments. This environment did not suit Paine easily. Secrecy felt uncomfortable to a man whose instinct was always to expose what he believed. The public had a right to know. He had built his reputation by speaking directly and distrusting hidden privilege. Now, the young republic expected him to protect confidential information. Even when he believed that information revealed misconduct, the conflict was almost inevitable. Once again, the same quality that made him valuable as a writer began making him dangerous as an employee. He could serve institutions when he agreed with their purpose. But obedience became difficult whenever institutional rules collided with his personal sense of truth. The breaking point came during a controversy involving Silas Deane, an American diplomat who had worked in France, obtaining military supplies. Accusations emerged concerning money, contracts, and whether private profit had become mixed with public service. Paine believed the public deserved an explanation. In defending the revolutionary government against what he considered misleading claims, he revealed information connected to secret French assistance. The disclosure created a political storm. What Paine regarded as honesty, others regarded as a serious violation of confidence. Foreign policy depended upon discretion, and France had reasons for keeping its early support hidden. The result was painfully familiar. Paine resigned his position. Once again, he had entered an institution, challenged the way it operated, and eventually found himself outside it. The pattern had followed him across the Atlantic. Workshops had not contained him. The excise service had not contained him. Now, even a government born from principles he had helped popularize could not comfortably contain him. There was an irony in this that he may not have appreciated. Paine could help people imagine new political structures, yet he struggled to live quietly inside almost any structure once it existed. Financial uncertainty returned quickly. Fame did not feed him reliably, and the decision to surrender much of the potential profit from his revolutionary writing now became expensive. Other men connected to independence acquired land, offices, professional reputations, or commercial opportunities. Paine possessed something more difficult to spend. People knew his name, but recognition did not guarantee rent or food. The author whose pamphlets had reached hundreds of thousands of readers could still find himself worrying about ordinary expenses. Revolutions often celebrate sacrifice in public, while leaving the person who sacrificed to calculate the cost alone at night. Friends and political allies tried at different times to help him. Public bodies recognized that his writing had contributed to the cause, and he eventually received financial assistance and property. Yet his relationship with money remained uncertain. He was generous when caution would have been wiser. He invested energy in causes rather than building security. When he believed an idea belonged to humanity, charging heavily for access to it seemed almost morally uncomfortable. This made him admirable to some and impractical to others. Paine could imagine political systems designed for generations not yet born, but planning his own peaceful retirement seemed strangely beyond him. The war itself continued through years that must have felt much longer to the people living inside them than they appear on a historical timeline. Paine kept producing installments of the American crisis whenever circumstances demanded another appeal to endurance. Victories brought relief, but not certainty. Defeats returned fear. Foreign assistance strengthened the American position. France formally entered the conflict against Britain, changing the balance of the war. Gradually, what had once looked like a rebellion that might be crushed began to resemble a political reality that the British government could no longer easily reverse. When the decisive American and French victory came at Yorktown in 1781, the emotional landscape changed again. Large-scale fighting began to fade, although peace would still require negotiation. Men who had spent years imagining death could finally imagine home. Soldiers who had marched through winter began thinking about farms, businesses, wives, children, and debts waiting for them. Revolutions end strangely. There is no single moment when everyone feels safe at once. The gunfire becomes less frequent. Rumors travel. Negotiations continue somewhere far away. Gradually, people realize that the life organized around war must now become something else. For Paine, peace created a problem that victory could not solve. During crisis, his voice had possessed an obvious purpose when independence seemed impossible. He argued for it when soldiers were discouraged. He wrote to strengthen them when defeat appeared near. Urgency gave his language direction, but what becomes of a revolutionary writer when the revolution begins turning into administration? Nations after war require budgets, laws, trade agreements, roads, courts, and patient negotiation. The qualities needed to challenge an old world are not always the qualities rewarded while building a stable new one. He watched the emerging United States with pride, but also with disappointment. The new nation had rejected monarchy, yet political disagreement had not disappeared. Selfish interests had not vanished. Independence had not magically transformed human character. States argued with one another. Congress struggled for authority and money. Veterans worried about unpaid compensation. Ordinary citizens faced debts and taxes. Paine had never believed freedom would make every difficulty disappear. But the distance between revolutionary promise and daily government could still be unsettling. The sunrise he had helped describe was revealing all the ordinary imperfections of daylight, and yet his imagination was already moving elsewhere. Paine had always been fascinated by science, mechanics, and the possibility that reason could improve practical life as well as politics. He began thinking seriously about bridge design, especially structures capable of spanning wide rivers without requiring many supporting piers beneath the water. Iron fascinated him as a material that might allow new forms of construction. The revolutionary pamphleteer began sketching curves, studying forces, and imagining enormous arches. To many people, this might have seemed like another restless change of direction. To Paine, politics and engineering belonged to the same deeper instinct. Both asked whether inherited structures were really the best structures available. A bridge did not deserve to remain badly designed, merely because older bridges had been built that way. A government did not deserve obedience merely because earlier generations had obeyed it. In both cases, Paine wanted to begin with principles, examine the forces involved, and construct something that worked better. The war was ending, but his rebellion against unnecessary limitations was not. Soon that instinct would carry him back across the Atlantic, toward Europe, toward another revolution, and toward conflicts even more dangerous than the ones he had just survived. Peace did not give Thomas Paine the quiet life that might have followed a long revolution. The war was ending, but his own future remained strangely unsettled. He had helped persuade people to imagine independence, encourage soldiers during moments of despair, and given language to a cause that had once seemed impossible. Yet, fame remained easier to recognize than to live on. He had no permanent profession, no large estate, and no reliable income that could protect him from uncertainty. Once again, the man who had helped change a nation found himself asking what he should do next. Some American leaders understood that Paine had sacrificed opportunities for personal profit while serving the revolutionary cause. Financial assistance and property were eventually offered to him, including a farm where he might have settled into a quieter existence. For another man, this could have become the natural ending of the story. He might have spent his remaining years remembering the revolution, receiving visitors, and growing comfortable with the reputation he had earned. But Paine had never been good at becoming still. Whenever one question seemed settled, his mind moved toward another problem that everyone else had learned to accept. During these years, his attention returned to science and engineering. Rivers fascinated him because they presented a problem that was both physical and philosophical. People needed bridges, but traditional designs often required heavy stone piers rising from the water. Those supports could interfere with navigation and become vulnerable to currents, ice, and debris. Paine began wondering whether iron could allow builders to create a wide arch that crossed a river with fewer supports beneath it. The idea seems distant from politics. Yet, in his mind, the same habit was operating. Look at the old structure, question its limitations, then imagine another form. He studied curves and forces with the seriousness he had once given political arguments. Models were built, drawings were prepared. He spoke with craftsmen and men experienced in metalwork. Paine was not a formally trained engineer, just as he had never been a formally trained political philosopher. This did not discourage him. Much of his life had been shaped by entering rooms where his credentials suggested he did not belong. He trusted observation, reasoning, and experiment. If an idea could be tested, he believed it deserved consideration regardless of whether its author possessed the correct title. The bridge became more than a technical project. It offered Paine the possibility of creating something permanent that did not depend on politics. Pamphlets could be attacked, forgotten, or burned. Governments could change. Reputations could rise and collapse. But a bridge had weight. People could walk across it. Wagons could travel over it. Generations might use it without knowing the name of the man who imagined its shape. Perhaps there was something comforting in that thought. After years of arguments, Paine seemed drawn toward an object that could prove itself simply by standing. To develop the design, he needed access to skilled ironworkers and financial support beyond what he could easily find in America. Europe offered those possibilities. So once again, he crossed the Atlantic. The journey carried him back toward a world he had once escaped. But he returned with a completely different identity. The dismissed excise officer who had left England in poverty was now known internationally as the author of Common Sense and the American Crisis. People who would once have ignored him were willing to meet him. Success had finally opened doors, although Paine remained suspicious of the world behind them. In England and France, he moved among scientists, inventors, political thinkers, and reformers. Discussions could move from mechanics to government in a single evening. The late 18th century was alive with the belief that reason might transform almost every part of human existence. Machines were improving. Scientific societies exchanged discoveries. Old religious assumptions were being questioned. Political thinkers debated the meaning of liberty and natural rights. To Paine, these developments were connected. Humanity was learning that inherited explanations were not always final. If technology could improve, perhaps institutions could be redesigned as well. Then France began to change with astonishing speed. Financial crisis, food shortages, public anger, and resentment toward privilege were placing enormous pressure on the monarchy. The old social order had divided people into estates and protected privileges that seemed increasingly difficult to defend. Ordinary families struggled with the price of bread, while symbols of aristocratic wealth remained visible everywhere. Conversations that had once belonged to philosophers entered streets and public halls. Political language became urgent. Words such as liberty, rights, representation, and citizenship began carrying the emotional force of promises rather than theories. When crowds in Paris attacked the Bastille in the summer of 1789, the event became a symbol far larger than the fortress itself. The building represented royal authority and arbitrary imprisonment, and its fall seemed to announce that fear had changed direction. People who had spent generations fearing power were discovering that power could fear them. Across Europe, some watched with horror and others with exhilaration. Paine belonged to those who initially saw the French upheaval as part of a larger movement. America had challenged inherited political authority. Perhaps France was beginning its own transformation. The connection felt deeply personal. Paine had never believed that the American Revolution belonged only to Americans. To him, the principle was wider. If government existed for the people, then geography did not change the principle. If hereditary power was irrational in America, it did not become reasonable when carried across the Atlantic. If ordinary people possessed natural rights, those rights could not depend on whether they were born in Philadelphia, London, or Paris. His political imagination had always moved toward universality. Freedom was not supposed to stop at a national border, but in Britain, the French Revolution awakened a very different fear. Many political leaders saw events in France not as a hopeful experiment, but as a warning. If revolutionary ideas crossed the English Channel, they might encourage demands for parliamentary reform, broader representation, and challenges to inherited privilege. Supporters of the established order began defending the British Constitution as a source of stability against revolutionary chaos. Among the most influential voices was Edmund Burke, a respected political thinker who had once expressed sympathy for the American struggle, but strongly condemned the revolution developing in France. Burke argued that society could not simply be rebuilt according to abstract theories. Political institutions carried the experience of generations, and destroying them in the name of perfect principles could release forces no one could control. Tradition, in his view, possessed a wisdom that enthusiastic reformers often underestimated. Paine read this defense of inherited institutions and found himself facing almost the exact argument he had resisted throughout his life. Once again, authority was being protected because it was old. Once again, inequality was being wrapped in language that made privilege sound like social order. He decided to answer. The project began as a response to Burke, but Paine rarely remained inside the boundaries of a narrow disagreement. As he wrote, the argument expanded into something much larger. He began asking, what rights belonged to a person before any government existed? He questioned whether one generation had the moral authority to bind every generation that followed. He returned to monarchy, hereditary rule, representation, taxation, poverty, and the purpose of government itself. The result would become rights of man, and it would push his political thought farther than common sense had done. This time, however, the danger would be different. In America, Paine had written against a government located across an ocean, while surrounded by people already moving toward rebellion. Now he was preparing to challenge the political foundations of Britain while standing within reach of British law. The failed craftsman, who once struggled to keep an excise job, was about to confront hereditary power more directly than ever before. And the country he had left nearly 20 years earlier was about to decide that Thomas Paine was no longer merely troublesome. He was dangerous. Rights of man appeared first as an answer to Edmund Burke, but it quickly became something much larger than a disagreement between two writers. Paine was no longer defending only the French Revolution. He was asking readers to reconsider the foundations of political authority itself. Governments, he argued, did not own the people who lived beneath them. One generation could not permanently command every generation that followed. Institutions existed because human beings created them, and therefore human beings possessed the right to examine them, reform them, or replace them when they no longer served the public good. The argument reached beyond kings and constitutions. Paine looked at poverty and asked why government seemed so skilled at collecting taxes, yet so willing to accept suffering as unavoidable. He proposed public education for children whose families could not afford it. He imagined assistance for elderly people who had worked throughout their lives. He supported relief for families facing hardship and suggested that taxation should fall more heavily upon those with greater wealth. These ideas were radical, not because poverty was new, but because Paine refused to treat poverty as a permanent feature of nature. He was moving toward a different understanding of government. Political freedom was important, but freedom meant little to a child who could not learn, an elderly worker who could no longer survive through labor, or a family one illness away from ruin. Government should not merely protect property and punish crime. It could help create the conditions in which ordinary people possessed some real chance to live with dignity. Paine was not describing a perfect society. He was asking a simpler question. If public institutions collected resources from everyone, should they not return something meaningful to those who needed support most? The book found an enormous audience. Editions circulated quickly, and political discussion moved beyond private clubs into workshops, taverns, reading societies, and streets. Reformers welcomed Paine because he spoke in the language of people who had rarely been invited into constitutional debate. Authorities saw the same quality and became alarmed. An argument becomes more threatening when ordinary citizens can repeat it without needing a university education. Paine was not writing for a small circle of philosophers. He was giving working people a vocabulary for asking why political power, representation, taxation, and privilege had been arranged. As British officials eventually decided that the line had been crossed, Paine was charged with seditious libel, accused of publishing material intended to undermine the established political order. The man who had once served the British government as a poorly paid excise officer was now being treated as an enemy of that government. The transformation might have seemed astonishing to anyone who had known him in Lewis, yet Paine himself probably saw continuity rather than contradiction. He had spent much of his life asking whether authority deserved obedience. Now, authority had begun asking whether his questions deserved punishment. Before the government could imprison him, Paine crossed to France. Behind him, a trial proceeded without his presence, and he was found guilty. Returning to Britain could now mean arrest. Another country had effectively closed its doors to him, but France welcomed him with extraordinary enthusiasm. Revolutionary supporters treated him as an international symbol of liberty. Despite his limited command of French, he was granted citizenship and elected to the National Convention. Once again, history had placed him somewhere almost unbelievable. The former staymaker from Thetford was now participating in the government of revolutionary France. At first, the moment seemed to confirm everything Paine had hoped about political change. Monarchy had been overthrown. Inherited privilege was under attack. Citizens were debating constitutions and rights. Old institutions that had seemed permanent only a few years earlier were disappearing. But revolutions do not move according to the clean logic of pamphlets. France was at war with foreign powers. Fear of invasion mixed with fear of betrayal from within. Political factions accused one another of treason. Crowds demanded punishment. Suspicion entered private relationships. The language of liberty remained everywhere, but increasingly it stood beside the language of enemies. Then came the question of what should happen to the former king. Louis XVI had been removed from power and placed on trial. Many revolutionaries believed that execution was necessary. To them, the king represented betrayal, foreign conspiracy, and the old regime they were trying to destroy. Paine had spent years attacking monarchy more fiercely than most of the men now judging Louis. Yet when the question became whether the former king should die, Paine resisted. Destroying monarchy as an institution was one thing. Deliberately killing a defeated man was something else. His position surprised people. Paine argued that Louis should be spared and sent into exile, perhaps to America, where he could live as a private citizen in a country that had already rejected kings. There was a certain poetic logic to the idea. A man once surrounded by royal ceremony could discover what life looked like without a crown. But Paine's argument was more than symbolism. He opposed the death penalty and believed a revolution founded upon human rights, it should be careful about making execution a political habit. Mercy, in his mind, could demonstrate greater confidence than revenge. The convention chose another path. Louis was executed in January of 1793. The blade fell, the monarchy lost its former king, and France moved deeper into a period in which political disagreement increasingly carried mortal danger. Paine had opposed the execution openly, and that position left him vulnerable as the balance of power shifted. Factions that had once stood beside one another against monarchy began turning against each other. The Girondins, with whom Paine was associated, lost influence. Their opponents gained control. Men who had helped create the revolution began disappearing into prisons. The Terror transformed politics into a landscape where yesterday's patriot might become tomorrow's traitor. Arrests multiplied. Executions became public warnings. People learned to measure their words carefully. Paine, however, had never possessed much talent for careful silence. He remained foreign-born, politically exposed, and connected to a defeated faction. His refusal to support the king's execution did not help him. Eventually, the revolution that had once celebrated him began to regard him with suspicion. In December of 1793, Thomas Paine was arrested and taken to Luxembourg prison in Paris. There is a dark symmetry in this moment. Paine had spent years arguing that governments should answer to individuals, that inherited power should fall before reason, and that human rights existed before political institutions. Now, he sat behind a locked door because a revolutionary government believed its survival justified imprisoning suspected opponents. Outside, France continued, speaking of liberty. Inside, prisoners waited, without knowing whether their names might appear on the next list for execution. The distance between ideals and institutions had never been more visible, and Paine was experiencing that distance not as philosophy, but as confinement. His health deteriorated during imprisonment. Illness weakened him, and the threat of execution remained close enough to become part of daily life. According to a story later attached to his imprisonment, a mark intended to identify prisoners for execution was placed on his cell door while it happened to be open. When the door was later closed, the mark was hidden from view, and Paine was overlooked. Whether every detail occurred exactly as later remembered, his survival was undeniably narrow. Many prisoners around him were taken away and never returned. Yet even there, with death no longer an abstract possibility, Paine continued writing. He turned toward the subject that had followed him from childhood through Quaker meetings, the established church, scientific reading, and years of political argument. If kings could be questioned, why not priests? If inherited political authority required examination, why should inherited religious authority be protected from the same demand? From illness and imprisonment began another work, The Age of Reason. It would become the most personally costly argument of his life, because challenging a government could make a man an enemy, but challenging religion could make him a stranger among people who once called him a friend. Paine had survived wars, poverty, failed marriages, dismissals, political attacks, and exile. Now, he was writing beneath the shadow of death, about God, reason, revelation, and the institutions that claimed authority over belief. Outside the prison walls, the French Revolution was consuming many of its own children. Inside, the aging revolutionary was preparing another argument that would follow him long after the prison doors finally opened. He could not yet know that surviving the terror would not restore his reputation. In some ways, the loneliest part of his life had not even begun. Thomas Paine remained inside Luxembourg prison for nearly 10 months. His health weakened, and for long stretches, he had no certainty that he would ever walk freely through Paris again. The revolution outside continued changing shape, consuming allies and enemies with equal speed. Men who had once spoken passionately about liberty disappeared into prison cells of their own. Paine had spent years believing that political institutions should be judged by their treatment of ordinary human beings. Now he was living inside the most intimate version of that argument, waiting behind a locked door while history moved beyond him. During those months, he continued working on The Age of Reason. The book did not reject belief in God. Paine believed in a creator and in a universe whose order could be approached through reason and observation. What he rejected was the claim that religious institutions possessed unquestionable authority over human thought. He challenged miracles, revelation, scripture, and doctrines that demanded belief, simply because generations had repeated them. To Paine, nature itself was a kind of sacred text. The stars, the seasons, the laws of motion, and the structure of the universe seemed more convincing than arguments protected from examination. It was perhaps inevitable that this book would wound his reputation more deeply than any political attack he had written. People who could forgive him for attacking kings were less willing to forgive him for questioning religion. Many Americans who had admired common sense now encountered a different Paine, one who seemed to challenge beliefs they considered central to morality and community. He had spent his life refusing to stop an argument where society wanted it stopped. Monarchy had not been sacred enough to escape examination. Government had not been sacred enough. Now organized religion would receive the same treatment. In November of 1794, Paine was finally released from prison after the fall of Robespierre and the end of the most intense phase of the Terror. Freedom returned, but not innocence. The France he emerged into was not the revolution he had imagined several years earlier. Too many people had disappeared. Too much fear had entered the language of liberty. Paine remained sympathetic to Republican government, but experience had taught him again that changing institutions did not automatically change human nature. A revolution could destroy a throne and still reproduce cruelty in another form. He remained in Europe for several more years, continuing to write, argue, and involve himself in political questions. His relationship with old allies became more difficult. He felt abandoned by people he believed should have helped him during imprisonment. Disagreements grew sharper. Age and illness made his temper more visible. The man who had once been welcomed as a revolutionary hero increasingly seemed like a survivor from an earlier moment. Revolutions had moved on. New leaders had appeared. The world Paine helped disturb was reorganizing itself without asking whether he approved of the result. Eventually, he decided to return to the United States. When he crossed the Atlantic again in 1802, nearly 3 decades had passed since his first arrival in Philadelphia. That earlier journey had carried an unknown man toward a continent preparing for revolution. Now, an aging writer returned to a nation that had already become independent and begun building its own political traditions. The country was familiar in name, but time had changed both America and Paine. Many of the people who remembered common sense also remembered the religious controversy that followed the Age of Reason. The welcome was therefore colder than the one his imagination may have preserved. Some old admirers still respected him, but others avoided him. Newspapers attacked his character. Religious critics described him as dangerous or immoral. Political opponents repeated stories about his drinking, his appearance, and his personal habits. Paine had never been easy to defend because he had never tried very hard to make himself respectable. He could be stubborn, argumentative, careless with money, and difficult in friendship. The man who believed humanity capable of reason was often remarkably impatient with individual human beings. He spent his final years moving between modest homes and the farm that had once been granted to him. His body weakened. The famous voice continued arguing, but fewer people seemed interested in listening. There is a particular loneliness in outliving the moment that made you necessary. During the Revolution, Americans had urgently needed language that could turn fear into independence. Decades later, the nation had presidents, elections, political parties, courts, and its own conflicts. The old pamphleteer no longer stood at the center of events. History had used his voice and then learned to speak without him. Thomas Paine died in June of 1809 at the age of 72. The funeral was small. Only a handful of people followed him to his grave. There was no great national ceremony for the man whose words had once traveled through revolutionary America. No enormous procession moved through the streets. No government paused to remember him with the scale his earlier influence might have suggested. He was buried on his farm in New York, surrounded not by the crowds that had once read his pamphlets, but by the quiet, that eventually receives almost everyone. Even death did not give him a simple ending. Years later, his remains were removed by an admirer who hoped to carry them to England and create a more honorable memorial. Instead, the plan failed, and the location of Paine's bones eventually became uncertain. Pieces were rumored to have traveled through different hands. Stories multiplied. The physical remains of a man who had argued about nations, kings, constitutions, and humanity simply disappeared. There is something strangely appropriate about this. Thomas Paine left behind no grand tomb capable of containing the meaning of his life. His ideas were more difficult to lose. Representative government, opposition to hereditary political power, public education, assistance for the elderly, progressive taxation, and the belief that government should answer to the people gradually became part of political conversations far beyond the world Paine knew. Not every proposal belonged to him alone, and many developed through countless other thinkers and movements, but he had helped make such ideas accessible to ordinary readers. He had spoken about government as though people without titles had the right to understand it, judge it, and participate in shaping it. Perhaps that is why his life cannot be reduced to success or failure. By conventional standards, he failed repeatedly. He lost jobs, marriages, money, friendships, and reputation. He spent time in prison. He died with relatively little public honor. Even his grave failed to remain intact. Yet the same man helped give political language to people standing at the edge of independence. He wrote, "When armies were afraid, he argued against hereditary power. When monarchies still appeared natural to millions, he imagined forms of social support that would not become ordinary political policy until generations after his death." And maybe the deepest part of his story has little to do with monuments. Thomas Paine was never proof that a brilliant person will eventually receive the recognition he deserves. Life was not that generous with him. His story suggests something quieter. A human being can be wrong, difficult, unsuccessful, lonely, and still produce an idea that matters. Wisdom does not always arrive wearing the clothing society expects. Sometimes it comes from the failed employee, the grieving husband, the immigrant, the prisoner, or the aging man whose neighbors have stopped listening. Somewhere in that thought, the young staymaker from Thetford returns again. He once spent his days helping shape garments around bodies, according to an accepted pattern. His entire later life became a refusal to accept patterns merely because other people had inherited them. He questioned the shape of government, the shape of religion, the shape of poverty, and the shape of authority itself. He was often wrong about people, and sometimes wrong about events, but he never became comfortable with the argument that something must remain unchanged, simply because it had existed for a long time. Perhaps this is why the story does not really end beside his grave. The bones disappeared, the rooms he lived in changed, and the crowds that once repeated his words became other generations. But the questions remained. Who gives authority its legitimacy? What does government owe the people beneath it? How much of our world is necessary, and how much is only inherited habit? Those questions still move quietly through modern life, and somewhere behind them remains the shadow of an ordinary man who lost almost everything several times, yet somehow found words that refused to disappear